Yeah, so we don't have any formal slides or anything for today. We're going kind of low tech with this one, but hopefully participatory as well. So yeah, we're hoping to have more of a conversation about some interesting discussion around Fiona, various aspects of the response. And we also hope to touch on kind of the theme of coordination and collaboration in terms of what we can learn from each other and from the impacts in different regions that were felt. So today I'll be serving as an interviewer of sorts. You can imagine two of us kind of sitting by a nice wood fireplace with snow coming down on the outside as we chat, and just asking about Corinne's experience volunteering in Cape Breton in the aftermath of the storm. And I will say, if anybody has questions, obviously we can use the chat, but if anybody wants to jump in with their own experience or thoughts, feel free to do so, because we have lots of time to have this conversation before lunch. Yeah, so just getting started. Corrine, you're from Cape Breton originally. You have family there. What was the mood or sentiment among your family and friends before, during, and after the storm?
I guess maybe I'll situate this a little bit. My family have been in the same little rural community in Irish Cove, Cape Breton on the Bredor Lakes, between St. Peter's and in Sydney along Route 4. My grandparents were farmers, and my grandfather owned carding mills and sawmills and that kind of thing. So I come from a rural stock of people, and they've been there, since like 1811, I think. You know, my family, the house that my parents live in, it's been in the family for that long. So, and my dad's currently 84, and my mom's close to 80. So they're elderly, and there are a lot of people like my parents living in rural communities throughout the island. Not that much different from here in New Brunswick. And like rural people, they are self-reliant and have I can, manage this kind of attitude. I think that Cape Bretoners, because of the history of mining, coal mining, and steel mills, and just the economic history of the island, people are very resilient, I guess. And so the attitude was, it's coming, I'm gonna prepare for it, and we've had them before. So I guess there was a lot of wondering how bad it would be. And I have a lot of my friends, like a lot of my girlfriends were on a chat, and we've scattered everywhere, but I do have a lot of friends that still live in Cape Breton. And so the chat was, what's happening now? Do you have power yet? What's going on now? You know, the same thing that we were all doing. So during the storm, it was, just lots of chatter about what's happening, how bad it is. And then lots of pictures of what people's yards were like, how people were, that kind of thing. And then after, you asked me about after as well. After, it was just a matter of it was really funny, actually, like not funny, but I was laughing at it being from Cape Breton. All over the news, it was don't go out, don't go out, don't go out. But there on social media and in our group chats, you had people were out everywhere, because you can't keep rural Cape Bretoners in the house. They've got to go see what's going on. So no matter how much the news and people said, don't go outside, they were in their cars, driving around, taking pictures, and just sharing experiences like, you can't get through George Street, you have to go around here, or, the whole informal network of community response was happening. So that's pretty much what it was like directly after. People were out assessing the damage. I think that people just didn't really think that it would be as bad as it was, because, right, we come from fishermen and farmers, and just that kind of, working class ability to just look after ourselves. So yeah, I think that people were quite surprised, like they were here in New Brunswick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And when you first arrived in Cape Breton to help support some of the recovery effort, give us a sense of kind of what you did first, or where you went, or who was in
Yeah,
charge?
well, I was here in Sackville, and I'm a planner, and I look at community planning, adaptation, and resilience. That's my work. So so I have that, academic part of me, but also, and then I was watching the news. I try to watch and listen to local news as much as I can whenever I can watch, the 6 o'clock evening news, because I think it's important to find out what's happening in your local community in this region, because of my job and whatnot. So I saw that relief efforts were happening, and I saw that Salvation Army had a piece on about trying to make enough meals for people, because people at that point had lost their power for a couple of days and they didn't know when they were going to get it back. So I looked on television, and the people that were cutting vegetables and serving food were my parents' age. So I thought I should get down there and see if I can help. So yeah, I just I think I went on a Thursday because I don't teach on Friday. So I spent day and night there until I came home on Monday, because I don't teach on Mondays. So I spent the whole time there volunteering, and it was chaotic. It was really chaotic. There were just a sense of overwhelmed. People were just overwhelmed, and just even going there, people, all my friends were saying, well, if you go, get gas before you go. So I brought gas containers with me, and I filled up gas, because the lineups for the gas stations were massive. Like, people were spending 6 hours in line waiting to get gas for their generators, for their cars. Yeah, it was really, really bad. So I kind of felt like I was going into literally a disaster zone, and that's what it was. So lots of people just didn't have the ability to cook, had lost all their food. And what was especially terrible about it was that a lot of the people with low income, I guess they get checks at the same time every month. And so those checks had just been received. And so when people get their checks, they go out and they buy a lot of food until a month later when they get their next check. And so they had just bought food to fill the freezer, and their freezers were full. So people lost all their food for the whole month. And so it was, there were stations set up where people could just walk up, and I served them coffee. There was big vans serving hot meals. There was no power anywhere, trees, everything all knocked down everywhere. You had to drive different routes in order to get to the destination. And it was really chaotic. Lots of response from the Nova Scotia Power, people from everywhere, from Vermont, from all over, fixing the lines and try to help people. And also when I got to the station at Salvation Army, the executive director told me that they're used to, I don't know, making X number of meals a day, say if it's 400, they were making thousands. Wow. And sending them out. And then so there was a spot where people could come pick them up. And then there were trucks coming in and taking them out to rural communities. We'd have a big box, and it would be saying for the nursing home in Lewisburg, and someone would come in and pick it all up and bring it out. And then there were multiple trucks that were going to different communities. So there was the location that the main location, and then a mobile unit would go out to the mall, would go to Glace Bay, and they'd send meals out. And that was happening for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And inside it was chaotic because, again, they weren't used to this, relying on volunteers. And, I would be walking around looking for whatever refillable cups, and somebody would be looking through boxes trying to help me find them, just because the scale was like was like disaster zone.
Right. Mm-hmm. And at that point too, when you were first arriving there and kind of getting yourself set up and everything, how did you sense that the other volunteers, but also the overall community there was feeling? You mentioned feeling like a disaster zone, and there was a lot of obviously disruption from a transportation side of things, also from a social side of things. So what was kind of the main emotion circulating, do you think?
It's the uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
how are we going to get through this? The immediate needs of when am I going to get my power back? But also just major concern about people who've lost the roof on their house and they didn't have insurance, and especially elderly people who are on a lower income. And a lot of people didn't have insurance because insurance is expensive. So they lost the roof, and just uncertainty, fear about the future. I
Mm-hmm.
think that would be real concern.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, I think that sentiment was felt, across the region for sure, particularly with the uncertainty piece, I think.
Yeah.
And what kind of stands out to you, I guess, is the most kind of surprising element of the time that you spent there volunteering, whether that be kind of on the volunteering side specifically in terms of the coordination and that sort of stuff, or the most surprising thing you saw in terms of the damage or whatever that might resonate with?
The most surprising thing, I guess, was the lack of resources in order to respond really quickly. I think that people did the best they could, but I guess I was kind of taking my lens, as my professional lens, into it as well. Just how uncoordinated everything was. It just seemed that there was a lot of different actors, and everyone was doing what they could, because it was immediate response. So you had the NGOs just responding, and then you had the municipality trying to do something, and then you had the province promising something, and then you had Justin Trudeau walking around, and it just seemed like a lack of coordination between all of these different the entities for responding. So that, I guess, the scale of damage was really surprising. But it was also, and just things that you don't think about, things that I didn't think about, even though I think about these things all the time, like the fact that gas stations were running out of gas. So even if people had a generator, they still had to keep buying gas. And I was on a chat with my friends, and I said to my friends, oh my gosh, I don't know how people are able to continue buying gas, because it's, gas is expensive. The prices of gas were going up because of the war and every other reason. So I don't know how people were affording it. And then my friend said, well, she and her husband both have great jobs. She said, well, I had a chat with my kids today and about running the generator, because we can't afford to keep buying gas to run the generator. So something like that, I never really thought about before. So that was really valuable. And then the people that get kind of lost, like being able to connect the theory and what happens on the ground, because I spend, like I said, so much time professionally thinking about it, and then you just see the gaps, and now I'm really thinking about how to make things better, I guess. The other surprising thing was I've spent a lot of my career in developing countries. Like I spent time in slums, informal settlements, looking at community climate adaptation. And I find it really interesting that the issues that I've seen in developing countries, we have the same kind of issues here in Canada, and we should be able to do things better because we have, the economic resources and educational resources, but there's still, and certainly, we are more privileged, but But I did feel like I was in a disaster zone in a developing country, actually.
Interesting. And so, yeah, and you mentioned kind of putting that professional lens on when you were there too, and kind of reflecting on the experience from that perspective. So I'm wondering, with your background as a climate researcher and planner, kind of what stands out for you in terms of those gaps for areas for future research or things that you want to focus on?
Definitely, the lack of coordination. I keep thinking about how to build back better, how to do things better. And we talked about this with COVID, it was this idealistic perception of doing things better and improving on things. And but I feel like when something happens, well, it's there's evidence that supports this around the world. It's not just my feeling about it. This is what disaster response studies, research shows, that people are just responding right away. And because the need is so immediate, because people just want their water back, they want their power back, they want to secure their home. And so very quickly, whether it's in Haiti, people are still trying to build back. It's just more of an immediate response. And because of that, we don't really take the time to assess the situation. We don't take the time to step back and say, or we don't have the time, maybe, I'm not sure. What can we do better? How can we learn from this? And then really strategically think about how we're going to do things better. So rather than just pave the road over, maybe thinking about interlocking bricks, or think about stormwater management. But very often the need is just so quick that it just gets done really fast. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I saw. So how can we, rather than just respond, how can we step back, think about it, come up with a better plan, or maybe have a better plan in place for when it happens again? That's the first thing. The second thing is just this disconnect, like Melanie talked earlier about, there's all these studies, but how does that get implemented? So all of the different actors in their response, how can there be, more of I just see a big spreadsheet with how all of these different entities can work together, incorporating the best that everybody has, whether it's me who can bring in, research on planning, or if it's a climate scientist like Sabine, or someone who knows water and coastlines like Jeff, or if it's someone who, is 84 and he's lived in the same community his whole life, even though he didn't go to university like my dad, who knows the community and the land and the ocean better than anyone. So I just think that there's a chance to connect all these different actors and try to not work in silos in order to come up with almost like a spider web of a response on how we can respond better.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And that's, I remember learning about a similar type of cycle that happens with flooding events as well, where the flooding event happens, we do the response, and then for a while we talk about, okay, like we got to do better next time, we got to figure out what we're doing, and then the cognitive kind of disconnect kicks in, where we start that process, and then as a couple of years goes by, or a year goes by, that kind of starts to fade, and we forget what that extreme response situation felt like and why we wanted to have a more coordinated response in the first place. So it's a really interesting piece there. Yeah, and of course, today's conference theme is Beyond Infrastructure, which kind of speaks to me in thinking about the impacts of extreme weather like Fiona more broadly, and understanding that obviously there was a lot of impacts to infrastructure, hard infrastructure, as part of the storm. But, from what you've said, and I know what other people have experienced, we're also seeing in these cases the really serious implications from the social and economic and physical and mental health of humans in our communities when we have storms like this. So, I mean, you talked about a number of those, but just wondering if there's anything else you wanted to reflect on from that in terms of how you kind of perceive the storm affecting daily life, even now, even today, for many folks across the region.
Oh, for sure. I mean, people still don't have, people still have tarps on their roofs because they can't afford to fix their roof, or they still have holes in their homes and they have mold that's now growing inside of their homes because of, you know, precipitation since the event. So now they just got hit with a storm, and you know, you see snow come in and collapse the tarps that are on the roofs, and the person that's living in there is in his 80s and he's by himself and he doesn't want to leave his house. He doesn't, you know, want to move to Ontario to his daughter's house. He just wants to stay in Glace Bay where he's been for 84 years and live a happy life until the end, right? So people are still suffering. And right now, the power is out again in Cape Breton because of a storm. I was talking to friends this morning, generator going again with the price of gas like it is. And so people still are feeling the consequences of this. So it's like a snowball, right? Because Fiona happens, and then it keeps rolling with events, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the problems associated with it. So it's just, as it happens more frequently, there's not a lot of time in order to be okay before the next big event happens. And I think that there are resources for people. You know, I think it was $100 if you had a tree. Well, that's not going to go very far. And there are some resources, but a lot of people haven't been able to access them. There's problems with it. Not everyone has a computer to fill something out. They don't know how to get there. People might not know how to, you know, fill out an application. Like, there's lots of people that are getting lost through the cracks. And so I think that that's a major problem.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point for sure. Yeah, so I mean, hearing about coordination piece, you know, making sure that programs are accessible for people when we have disasters like this, and then also figuring out ways that we can, you know, more rapidly respond and rapidly plan for those next ones, knowing that when we have, you know, fall hurricanes, it's, you know, you wake up a few weeks later and we're getting the snow. So, I mean, yeah, just to wrap up before the question period, just wondering if you would have any, you know, recommendations, maybe like a top 3 recommendations for, you know, community organizations or governments who are kind of more in a position of coordinating this type of response, and what you would say to those folks in terms of your experience and what you've been hearing.
Well, I guess, you know, reflecting on it, and rather than actually just criticizing it, what did we do right? What worked well? Developing a strategy for the next time, which incorporates coordination of efforts, trying to be, as these things become more common, we have to move beyond being reactive to them. So we have to have systems in place for a disaster. And so, you know, maybe an institutional framework that that looks at all the different reasons, so that we're able to not just keep putting the same bridge up every time it falls down. Maybe think about something different. Because like I said, like, here we are, we're in a rich country, and the responses are the same as we'd see in Nepal, you know, years or 10 years after the earthquake, people are still recovering, or in Haiti, people are still trying to recover. So I think that would be the most obvious for me.
Great. Okay. No, those are great. Yeah, Zahira, maybe we'll bring you back in just to help facilitate some of the question and answer discussion stuff if there's folks that have other things they want to add or ask.
And I'm also interested in hearing people's own perspectives. Like, please share your own experiences, because I'd love to hear the experiences and what other people think about this, because this is an area that I haven't conducted a lot of research on. I know that there's frameworks, international frameworks on disaster risk reduction. And I think that there's a disconnect between that entire literature about disaster risk reduction and the climate adaptation. the climate adaptation work. So, you know, you have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction through United Nations. How's that being implemented? What about those resources being used at community level?
Yeah, so thank you very much to both of you for that fantastic conversation. I think it was very valuable to all our participants. I know there's a couple of questions. Zomi, do you want to chime in and ask the questions for us?
Sure. So the first one is, comment réussir à convaincre les décideurs d'implanter?
The first is, how do you convince decision makers to implement better infrastructure to make sure that we're better positioned in zones that are at risk?
Adam, do you want to answer that, or do I answer this, or can anyone?
Oh, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay.
I can add in a couple comments.
Was the question how to convince decision makers to do things a little bit differently?
I should probably let the interpreters do that. Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure I got it right. Yeah. So how do you do it? Well, obviously they must know this. So I think that we do, you know, people like me, we have a role to play in taking our research outside of the classroom and put it into communities where it's implementable. So, you know, for example, being able to notice these things and maybe conduct research on the area and get some evidence and make it public, make people aware, and also look at different case studies. So not just criticize, but show what's worked elsewhere and work with people in order to try to provide some solutions. So I think it's about being active, you know, knocking on decision makers' doors, talking to them, finding out about what their problems are, what's wrong with systems, and just being able to help provide solutions to that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that for sure. And I think in my experience through some of our projects, particularly focused on coastal communities in the last couple of years, what we're hearing more and more is that it's the community members and the people there that want to see these changes to restrict infrastructure in at-risk areas. So I think it's a matter of, you know, building that collective voice and that local voice for that type of regulation or that type of approach to go into place. So I think that, you know, that's a big piece. And I think it's also highlighting, like you said too, kind of where this has been successful and kind of what approaches have been taken, and in a way that's been rolled out in conjunction with communities and with people on the ground, because I think that that's where you get the biggest buy-in for sure. You know, the regulation or the approach, whatever it be, policy, regulation, or whatever, that kind of fits the best with that particular context for sure.
Yeah, I think that it's important to hear from communities, actually, to find out what they think and what they perceive, and what barriers do they have with responding. Maybe having some kind of a post-disaster world cafe where people share their experiences and then collectively come together as a community to come up with solutions, working with decision makers. But if anyone out there, you know, has ideas, experiences, please feel free to answer any of these questions. Just pop in and answer them, because I don't have all the answers.
No, fair enough.
I have another question for you. Is a 72-hour preparedness kit enough time given our ability to respond?
Oh, I'd say no.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think if we can learn anything from this one,
sure.
Yeah, I think if we can learn anything from this particular event, no, and I think that, you know, having the homeowner have a 72-hour emergency kit, I think is a really big step at making sure that, you know, our local governments and other groups that are involved in response, that they can picture themselves in a situation post that 72 hours and how they would support people with the resources that they had in their 72-hour emergency kit that are now spent after that 72-hour period. So again, coming back to the economic point too, I think that, you know, those kits and everything that goes into them, there's a cost to that. And so every 24 hours you add on to that 72-hour emergency kit, you know, there's an increased cost to the individual or to the homeowner. So I think, again, you know, there is a threshold there in terms of what people can have in their house or the place where they're living. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a role for some of those response organizations and entities to kind of think about that post 72-hour period for sure.
Yeah. I just want to add just a quick point that I thought about before I want to remember to say it. The response, it's just not, you know, in a month, 2 months, 3 months afterwards. I just think that we need to learn from this and incorporate how our zoning, you know, change zoning so that different, you know, we incorporate green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, all these things that we talk about, we know as climate adaptation specialists. So, you know, it's ongoing. Urban planning, the way communities are designed, it all has to change. So that has to be incorporated into it as well.
Thank you. Malheureusement, on n'a pas beaucoup de temps pour les questions pour
We
cette.
don't have a lot more time for questions this time around, but if you want to put them in the chat, that will help us.
Next question is, many organizations are seeing a noted decrease in volunteerism, and there's a wonder of how or if this is impacting disaster response.
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot. You know, when I volunteered, it was mainly older people and international students, like the students there's a lot of students from India now at CBU and Cape Breton University. And those were all the volunteers. And, you know, when I grew up, that's what you know, if you had a social life, you were volunteering. That was the only way to have a social life, was volunteering at the Strawberry Festival. That was it in rural Cape Breton. So you had an incentive, but also it was expected of you. So I go home now and I see my Aunt Margaret and she's volunteering me for something in the local hall. So that's kind of the culture I grew up in. So I guess I'm doing this work honestly, but I think about, like, I'm going to go into Corrine the scholar person now. I think that there is kind of a disconnect now where everyone's on their devices looking down. We have Facebook where people can communicate more, but I do wonder whether or not we are becoming more isolated and just not checking on each other as much as we should. I see Robert's had his hand up for a while. I'm kind of curious what he wants to say.
Do you think he might be able to put that in the chat? I'm hoping.
Oh.
Is that okay? Or maybe Zahira can decide that.
I just didn't know if anyone saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can put it in the chat.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
So the next question, we've got a few more. I'm going to try to squeeze them in. How common or not is it for organizations to plan or governments to plan a response for what is likely to happen, such as a fishing wharf being damaged at some point? Do you pre-plan the response? For example, don't put the fuel tanks back where they were.
Exactly. Yeah. How common is it? Depends, maybe. Depends on the location, but that's an obvious, that's what we're kind of hoping for, right? Pre-plan the response. That's what we would be aiming for.
How do we reconcile protecting the identity of small at-risk communities and the desires of their residents with the costs and efforts related to adapting in order to continue living in those communities? At what point does retreating and favoring densification become the better option?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It's a question about the difference in resources and logistics needed to make a small at-risk community resilient versus how many more people in an urban center, for example, or a higher density population, like how to weigh those two factors. And at what point does retreating and favoring densification become the better option?
But I'm wondering if that means just not servicing rural areas and trying, because already, you know, most municipalities have densification strategies in order to build within the urban boundary. But there is still, you know, rural life and farming and providing our food security that's still very relevant, and fishing communities. So it's not like we can prevent people from living in rural communities, I guess. So I think that we still have to do both, that one can't be favored over the other. I think that in the response, there is a lot of community cohesion within rural communities, and it's just a matter of, you know, years ago, I'm going to digress a little bit here, but years ago, they had something called the people schools. I don't know, you've probably heard me talk about it before if you've been on something I've been on. And it's when people in rural communities would gather, whether it's in a kitchen, to learn about a specific topic. So a bunch of coal miners would get together, and somebody would come in from the university and talk about, I don't know, how to start a blueberry farm, and people would come and learn about it. So I think that just having these small people schools throughout communities, and be able to do more community work on response, I think that would be really beneficial. But it would involve people who are someone like me, or someone who does this kind of work to proactively work with communities on it.
Yeah, and I think maybe if I can just add one more thing too for Adrian's question, I think it's a really big question in terms of where's the threshold of when communities start to talk about retreat, or talk about, you know, shifting the development of the community to a different area given the risks. And I don't think it's going to be kind of a one size fit all approach. And I think that it is going to require a lot of reconciling between, you know, what that similar to when we were talking about influencing decision makers, like what that community is ready for and what that community wants. And I think because we have, I agree, like a really high level of social cohesion in our rural communities throughout the Maritimes and throughout Atlantic Canada, I think that there is going to be an opportunity for that conversation to start happening. And maybe in a way that is unique to our region and other parts of the country and other parts of the world, because we have that strong cohesion. So I think it's going to be interesting to follow that. But I think that there are going to always be, you know, the costs and benefits of doing that. But I also think that, you know, we're starting to see more examples of that approach being taken out of necessity. And I think that, you know, the identity of a lot of our communities, yes, are tied to place, but because, again, of that strong social cohesion, like I believe that we have a lot of identity tied to the people and the you know, the families and the history of a lot of the communities here too. So I think that there is an ability to preserve some of that identity and preserve some of that, you know, desire to be a community in a slightly different place over time. So anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's what communities around the world are already facing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's communities that have lived in a specific coastal area in Bangladesh for generations, and they unfortunately have to move. So I think that's when we talk about the health indicators too, because there'll likely be trauma and emotional issues attached to that.
Okay. That was a fantastic conversation. I think the questions were really, really interesting. We're coming into lunchtime. So do we want to just do one last final thoughts from each of you before we close up for lunch or break for lunch?
Sure, go ahead, Corrine.
Oh, and thank you for the conversation. It's been really fun actually to talk like this, just in a casual way. And anyone who wants to reach out to me to chat more about solutions, I'm happy to share my email address. So yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah, and similar for me too. It was a nice different style to try at something like this. So hopefully people got some good stuff from it. And know that as time marches on, we're all still kind of reflecting on Fiona and other related extreme weather events. So I think that hopefully it was helpful for everyone to kind of digest a little bit of their own experience too.
Well, thank you again for both of you for giving us this time.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're on lunch right now. I've got